This is Dr. S.K. Low, President of Asian American Unity Coalition, or in short, AAUC. Thank you for listening to our AAUC podcast series on building our collective American dream. Please subscribe and comment on our podcast and tune in to our next podcast episode on the last Sunday of each month at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. The AAUC podcast is supported by our active individual lifetime members and organization members. For more information about AAUC, please go to our website at asamunitycoalition.org.
Welcome to AAUC's podcast series on building our collective American dream. I'm Jack Hanna, AAUC board member and public policy chair, and am your host for today's podcast. The focus of our podcast today is the importance of data and data collection in forming public policy. Our guest for this episode is Suhag Shukla, a co-founder and current executive director of the Hindu American Foundation, or HAF. HAF is a member of the Asian American Unity Coalition, and it has successfully organized and expanded its work and impact here in America since its inception 20 years ago. What is HAF, and what kind of work does HAF do? How has data collection enabled HAF to exert influence on public policy? What mindset is needed for coalition building? Let's find out from Suhag Shukla. Welcome, Suhag Shukla, to the AAUC podcast series, Building Our Collective American Dream. We are very pleased you've joined us today to discuss the strategic importance of data collection in order to effectively represent and advocate for all respective Asian American communities. Suhag, you are the co-founder of the Indian American Foundation. How did that come to be, and how has the organization evolved since its inception?
Thanks, Jack, for having me and asking me a question about basically what has become my life's work. I am a second generation Hindu American and Indian American. My parents immigrated to the United States in the mid and late 60s. I am a product of America's immigrant story. And I grew up in a pretty traditional Indian household in an Indian community, but really grew up straddling two cultures and two identities. My American culture, or American side, which entailed hanging out at the mall with friends and all the things that you would imagine in a young teenager's life. And then at home, learning the language, learning about the traditions, celebrating our holidays. And I, like my co-founders of Hindu American Foundation, grew up similarly. And as we got older, looking to things like the media or looking at how our culture and traditions were presented in public school textbooks, or even at the college level, the way in which we were being studied and talked about, we saw a real fundamental disconnect between our lived realities and how we viewed the world and how we saw our history and story with how it was being presented by others. And so we started the Hindu American Foundation back in 2003 to build an articulate and credible voice to educate the public about Hindus and Hinduism. And that was going to entail both a proactive approach, meaning that we were going to create content, work with scholars, many of whom are from the tradition and culture, who could begin telling our story on our terms. And then also in a reactive manner, in that where there were stereotypes in the media, that we would build the relationships that were necessary with journalists or with other stakeholders to provide them proper information. That's our education portfolio. We also saw that there were a number of critical conversations and debates occurring across our country on important issues like civil rights, like religious liberty and religious freedom, human rights, climate change, you name it. And what was absent from these conversations was an Indian American voice. And where there might have been an Indian American voice, there may not have been a uniquely Hindu American voice. And I think that the diversity of our communities is not just on the basis of, say, race or ethnicity, technology, but also religion plays a role in how we might view solutions. And so that was kind of the catalyst and the inspiration for us starting HAF. We were in our late 20s, early 30s when we started HAF, and we really looked to other communities, specifically the Jewish community, even the Buddhist community to some extent, to see how were they meeting their educational and advocacy needs. And the one key thing that we saw as instrumental to their success was a professionalized model, meaning that they were investing in people who would make education and advocacy of the community a full-time profession, so that you were able to cultivate the subject matter expertise, be able to build the relationships that are necessary, function and succeed in this marketplace. And so we all pitched in some seed money, a couple $1,000s here and there. And then we turned to our community. And the biggest piece of HAF's success is our community, because what our parents' generation essentially recognized is that we have invested in building the institutions that are going to preserve and pass on our culture. Here's a set of young people who want to now invest in building a bridge between our community and mainstream America. And so they began supporting us in a significant manner, in a manner that allowed us to begin building out a professional staff. So we went from 1 or 2 staff members to now 14, and we're looking forward to growth. So that would probably be the most fundamental change or evolution of the Hindu American Foundation.
Suhag, during your work with HAF previously, it's my understanding that you affiliated with the Pew Foundation a few years ago on a project that involved data collection regarding the Hindu community and maybe the Indian community. Would you please describe your involvement and what lessons and insights you acquired from that experience, specifically regarding data collection?
So we worked with Pew. We've also worked with some other smaller scale surveys that have been conducted on religiosity or other aspects of the Indian American community. And I can't emphasize enough the importance of getting people from within the communities that are going to be studied involved from the get-go, because oftentimes what happens is that where surveys are created in a vacuum, they oftentimes miss, because once you put that survey out there and all the investment in time and resources that is required in getting people to engage, you want to make sure that you're going out with something that's not just comprehensive, but has cultural competency, so that you're asking questions in a manner that are going to elicit the types of information that you want. So with Pew, this was ahead of their major survey that they conducted in India, and it involved something like 30,000, maybe more respondents. Some of the other surveys that I have been involved in the sense that we were just consulted about what are some of the pitfalls, what are things to look for, those were smaller and they were focused on Indian Americans here or temple communities. And it really gave the researchers an opportunity to talk to us about the types of information they were going to ask, how they were going to frame those questions. And we were able to provide cultural context to all of that. How might a question land, for instance? I'll just give you an example. One of the questions for religiosity was really getting focused on temple attendance. And while in the Christian or Judaic context, temple or synagogue worship might be an indicator of religiosity, for Hindus, it isn't necessarily, because the Hindu practice is very personalized and it can be at any given point in the day. Most Hindu households will have some sort of worship space in the home. It's not a measure of irreligiosity. They would have missed a major data point had they not thought about that. So that's just an example of how questions, while they might be well-meaning, don't necessarily capture the richness. Even if it's numerical, I think there's still opportunities to carry or collect the richness and the depth and the breadth of these different communities being studied. Another example I'll give you is one of generational differences, especially amongst Indian Americans. Some of the early surveys don't take into account that there's a steady influx of immigration from India. Not only is there a steady the inflow of immigration, but the experience of each immigrant generation, so to speak, is going to be different. When my parents came here in the 60s, if they wanted Indian groceries, they would, from California, have to write out an order for certain ingredients and either send them to one store that was well known amongst the immigrant community in Chicago and another one in New York. Now you can buy Indian food at Trader Joe's. So the reality of an immigrant today is very different from one in the 60s. Add to that subsequent generation. So I was born and raised here. I'm one generation out of India. My experience, my attitudes are going to be very different from that of my parents. Now you add my children to the mix. They are now 3 generations out. And many of these surveys didn't even have that sort of complexity woven into the questions that they were asking. If survey takers or researchers bring stakeholders into the conversation well before the questions are built out, they tremendously improve what they find.
So, Suhag, in this day and age of more and more data collection that's being acquired throughout the internet, all over the world, how has data segregation of the AAPI population here in the United States started to affect policy makings in education, in healthcare, public policies, community organizing? And what changes in the direction do you see it going in the future?
It is so critically important to have this kind of data. But I think also we need to keep the data in context, because the data is as good as the safeguards that are taken in terms of sample size, the randomness of a sample, any sort of biases that might enter in the sample collection or even in the framing of questions. All that aside, data does end up driving policy. Data also signals to the community an importance of organizing. If you are not on the radar of policymakers, I think it's difficult to even understand the importance of organizing and being equipped with the types of numerical information that's going to make our stories that much more compelling. So let's just take the recent example of rising hate crimes against Asian Americans. If we don't have a baseline of how many Asian Americans are in a particular region, how many hate crimes are occurring in that region, it's going to be difficult for law enforcement to understand the gravity or scale of a problem. They're also going to have difficulty in outreach and a number of other things to know there's an area that does have a high concentration of Asians, but that sort of information is not available to law enforcement. The motivation to set aside resources for outreach or for special programs that help Asian communities secure their businesses or secure their houses of worship, all of that gets impacted. And that's where data is so critical in order to help both in representing the community as well as ensuring the well-being of a community. Another area might be healthcare. When you are able to show there particular diseases that are impacting a community more than others, are the treatments, should they be different? All of these things can be influenced, because if you can't show numerically the widespread nature of something, it's going to be hard to get resources and funding to help address those issues. And that's where data is so important.
What specifically interests you about the recently released Census Bureau's 2020 data, and how does HAF intend to use it?
The census data is important to us, especially because our community specifically has seen almost 2 to 3-fold growth in the last 10 years. And having that information allows us to, one, advocate for our community in a more thoughtful manner. We're able to identify the regions in which we have larger communities, and that way we're also able to focus our resources. It also tells us where HAF needs to grow. If there's regions beyond the areas in which there were large numbers of Indian and Hindu Americans, were the San Francisco Bay Area, Illinois and the Chicago greater area, New York, New Jersey, Dallas, Houston, and Florida, where they were looking at Tampa or South Florida, Fort Lauderdale, Miami area. But there might be other areas where the Indian American community is growing. So for us and our advocacy, it's certainly helpful to know where where are those areas of growth? From a policy perspective, because we do work in advocacy, whenever we go to Washington, D.C. and are talking to members of Congress, or even if we're working at the state level and talking to legislators, they want to know how many people we represent are part of their constituency. So having these types of numbers from the census really allows us to drill down and better convey the impact of different policies on particular populations, so that whether we want a member of Congress to support something or to oppose something, they have a better understanding of impact and ultimately votes. Are they going to lose votes or gain votes by taking a particular action?
Obtaining accurate as opposed to false or incorrect data appears recently to be more of a challenging task than before. How does HAF curate the data it uses to assure accuracy?
That is a great question. It's not just data, but information. We really are in an age of misinformation. We just fall back on tried and tested scientific methodology. We look at the source of data, how data has been collected, what sorts of biases may have impacted or influenced the information and the conclusions of a survey or a report or a study. How were the questions asked? And we also go in with full recognition that no data is going to be perfect. There's going to be some sort of shortcoming. And I think it's important to acknowledge that up front. And especially for our community, where even though we're growing, we're still, at least in demographic terms, a micro minority. So there's going to be difficulty in obtaining a good randomized sample, because a lot of the large data companies may not necessarily have the databases from which these researchers or institutions that are conducting surveys can tap into. So that's what we're looking at. How were the questions framed? Who did they reach out to? How did they reach out to them? How did they ensure for statistical errors? That's the way that you have to wade through information as well.
So does HAF conduct its own polls and surveys with regard to the Hindu community, and also obtain surveys from other entities and organizations in order to evaluate and then integrate it into your program and your efforts to advocate for the Hindu community in America?
Absolutely. We have conducted both formal and informal surveys, as well as qualitative studies on a variety of subjects. For example, 5 or 6 years ago, we conducted a bullying survey. What were the incidents or perceptions of bullying amongst Hindu American children? How did the way in which Hinduism in India were taught in public school textbooks, how did that impact their perceptions of bullying, their perceptions of self-worth? What we did is pull in experts who had experience in survey design, and they were able to help us formulate the questions and ask them in a way to address, at least to the best of our ability, any sort of confusion that might be created by poorly worded questions, to not ask leading questions, all of these things. So every single time we have done a survey, I certainly have learned so much about the science of survey methodology, and have really gained a deep respect for well done surveys, because I know how much time and thought is required to build out a proper one. And of course, we do more informal surveys. Let me first actually go back to that bullying survey. That bullying survey has really been helpful for us because no survey of that kind had been conducted. And so what we learned was sad and shocking for us in terms of the direct correlation between inaccuracies and stereotypes that are perpetuated through our public school education system and the impact that was having on the mental health and well-being of young Hindu American children. And having those types of statistics have been tremendously helpful in our engagement with teachers, because the last thing a teacher wants is to inadvertently lend to the bullying of children, or inadvertently inadvertently lend to teaching inaccuracies that then are having a direct impact on their students. And so that bullying survey in that sense has really helped both in our educational efforts as well as our advocacy efforts. Then talking about more informal surveys, those just help us constantly improve our programming. There's not really that much of a methodology involved. Did you find this program helpful? Yes or no? What would you have liked different? Was it too much information? Was it just right? That sort of information. And it definitely helps us. So it doesn't always give you the full picture, but even those types of informal surveys help inform our approach to a variety of issues and our programming.
Suhag, what direction do you see HAF going in the future as far as data collection, or what would you like to focus on to address the challenges that the Hindu community faces here in America?
I think there needs to be investment made in studying our communities. But while I'm seeing an increase in quantitative data, and there should be more of that, I think we also need qualitative data to bolster or provide more color to what sometimes data gives in black and white terms. One of the challenges I see with just a data-driven approach is the tendency to then portray our communities as a monolith, which it's not. And I think qualitative data provides the details and more of the individualized stories, can give policymakers, decision makers a more full picture of who we are, what things concern us, where we're contributing, and where we all can work together to ensure the well-being of our diverse communities and address the challenges that we're facing in a thoughtful manner, in a manner that does not inadvertently create more problems, but really find solutions that make sense.
To follow up on that, your efforts in developing partnerships and coalitions with other communities sounds as if it is an important effort and endeavor and focus of attention with regard to your organization. Describe why you think it's important and how you actually accomplish that.
I think coalition building or working in coalitions is really what constructive engagement is all about. All of us have differences in opinions on a variety of issues. We have maybe different ideas of what the solution might be. There might be areas where we vehemently disagree with one another on one issue, but there might be another area that's a shared concern where we align on both the gravity of a concern and what actions need to be taken to address that concern. And so coalition building allows us to focus in on one problem or one issue and advocate on that. But in that process, relationship build, get to know one another. But what happens in coalition building is that we may go in thinking that we disagree vehemently on this, and therefore I can't work with this person. But if you're willing to at least prioritize whatever issue it is that you're working on, that gives you an opportunity to build that relationship on a human level, and then over time build friendship to have those more complicated conversations. And maybe you find that your disagreement is a matter of degrees and not fundamental. And that's where we've been really fortunate in the faith-based space as well as in the ethnic space to participate in a number of coalitions with broader Asian umbrella groups and Asian coalitions. And that I would say is definitely newer because I think the Asian American community has woken up to the reality that we need to do this in spite of being so different, coming from so many different cultures and countries of origin. But also in the faith space, that's where I think sometimes the space could be a little bit more divisive, at least outwardly speaking, even though faith can be a force for good. Oftentimes there's philosophical or theological differences that oftentimes keep people from coming together. But I have found that working on specific issues like religious freedom or on human rights has provided opportunity for people of very different belief systems to come together and focus in on one issue, and then let that be the foundation for future friendships and future work.
We at AAUC look forward to partnering with HAF in the future and compliment and commend your efforts on constructing a fabulous organization. And we congratulate you and thank you for joining our podcast today. So Suhag Shukla, we thank you, the Executive Director and co-founder of the Hindu American Foundation.
Thanks so much, Jack. This was a pleasure.
I found it interesting that one of HAF's main focuses of attention has been data collection and how it is necessary to develop strategic policies that, one, specifically inform and educate the public about the Hindu community, two, protect and preserve religious freedom and inform the public about their religion, and three, promote coalition building and partnerships with Asian Americans and all Americans in advocating their common interests. Fascinating to hear how the Hindu American Foundation obtains and employs data effectively in using it as a tool for success. Lastly, I would like to invite you back for our episode next month in March when we will have Raymond Partalon of the Asian Pacific Islander American Vote Organization, their national field director, speak to us on how they collect and use data to enhance the voices of the Asian American Pacific Islander community. Thank you and hope you join us then.